So what I'm going to talk about, to set the context, I've got a lot of specific items to get through, so I want to frame it a little bit. I want to talk about how to balance between imposed order and emergent order, autonomy and hierarchy, markets and firms in various different contexts, different ways of dividing this up. But not just in terms of organizations, like business organizations and other organizations that we see, but also think about how these principles might apply to ourselves in the future, actually to, perhaps in the near term, to artificial general intelligences. We've had some talks on that and some ideas about how those could be designed. I think there are interesting parallels between very complex minds that may not work a little more differently than ours, which may have many interacting parts, and also post-human minds. Even our own minds, as we'll see, have a lot of different aspects to them. I'll talk a little bit about that idea, which don't always work together very efficiently. But in the future, if our minds become more complex, or we build artificial minds, they may be recognizable more as organizations than as unitary selves in the sense that we traditionally are used to. So I think there's some interesting parallels between organizations in the traditional sense and organized minds, post-human minds or artificial minds. So I'm suggesting that we look at some of these ideas as to how to balance between too much order of one kind, an imposed top-down order, and too much disorder, and think about how those practices and principles that are being applied in some of the best businesses might be applied to future minds. So that's kind of the context. Now, organizations we tend to not think of as technology typically. We tend to think, well, technology is, is computers and various tools like that. But organizations, of course, are tools. They are technologies themselves. They're social technologies that help us to coordinate our activities and get things done. A hammer helps us get things done by bashing in nails. Organizations have a lot more power and range than a hammer. So they certainly count as technology. So certainly we understand as transhumanists that humans co-evolve with technology, but they also co-evolve with organization. We can look at the history of organization and see how those have changed. They used to be pretty primitive, small numbers of people in tribes with a pretty top-down monkey hierarchy. And then we started getting larger and larger organizations as we developed countries and nation states and governments. We still didn't have anything for a long time, anything like modern business corporations. That's a pretty modern invention. There were family organizations and some larger ones in the 19th century and even a little before. But the modern corporation really is an invention of the early 20th century. Classically, Alfred Sloan is one of the major figures behind that, and of course Henry Ford. And we're still developing new forms of organization today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the possible future of organizations, but mostly I want to talk about how these principles apply to organizing just to the right level in the right way, both for traditional organizations and for people, for minds, whether human or not. Okay. So what is it that shapes organizations? Why do they assume a certain form? Why do we have these huge corporations that are global spanning, in some cases others that are very successful at a much smaller level? Why are some organizations very hierarchical? Why are others much more decentralized? Why does Google look different from General Motors? How is it that we have open source kind of organizations, very virtual organizations? Why is it that in John's terminology that we have unbundling of corporations where they're still very, very large organizations, but they may be kind of hollow, they may outsource a lot of functions, they may spin off a lot of functions, let other people run those things for them? What determines that? Well, I think there are a number of factors. There are transaction costs of various kinds. I think John mentioned Ronald Coase, I believe, is one of the pioneers. Several people have researched transaction costs, search and information costs, bargaining costs, pricing and enforcement costs. Now, depending on the relative transaction costs within an organization versus between one organization and others outside it, that will change the structure of the organization. For instance, let's say that the... Tom, what are you doing? You can just walk, that's okay. You completely failed, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, one of the things I was going to mention later is to celebrate failure. You failed spectacularly. We now know not to do that again. Okay. Okay. All right, back to transaction costs. Okay, let's assume that the transaction costs within an organization remain pretty stable, that the difficulties of making agreements, of communicating with people within the organization don't really change over a certain period of time. But the transaction costs of dealing with other companies, other individuals, other agencies outside the corporate walls go down, perhaps due to better communications, thanks to the internet enabling us to organize things on a virtual level. Well, that would tend to mean that organization activities move outside the company walls And it doesn't mean the company necessarily shrinks in any particular measure, except perhaps in number of people who are being paid directly on the salary. It doesn't necessarily mean the organization gets smaller. So it won't necessarily go that way. It could go the other way. Transaction costs may go down within the organization due to better technologies that make it easy to communicate, for instance, or to control things internally. There may be other problems outside that, for instance, political costs going up, corruption, for instance, lack of trust in a culture. That can all raise transaction costs between organizations, which is why, for instance, in China, there's a strong preference for family-based organizations because there's strong trust within the family unit, but much less so in society in general. So that will change both the size and the shape of organizations. There's also the role of technology. Now, we tend to think, we're sympathetic to the idea that technology is always empowering the individual, it's always decentralizing. That's kind of a bit of a mythology that's come along, I think, since the Silicon Valley days, and we're probably sympathetic to that. And that's sometimes true, but it's not always true. It depends on the kind of technology and how it's deployed. In fact, sometimes it seems a little paradoxical. I don't know how many of you are familiar, most of you probably, with enterprise resource planning systems, big monstrous computer systems, which seems like the ultimate centralizing technology in a way. But according to certain studies, that can actually have a decentralizing effect on organizations because it allows information to be pushed down to different lower levels of the organization where people have more autonomy and can make more decisions on their own. They don't have to go up to the top to get permission to do things or to find out the information they need. So that's a little paradoxical, perhaps. So with non-production decisions, it's been found that ERP can actually have autonomizing effects, as can CAD/CAM technologies, comparative design, comparative manufacturing. For production decisions, that can also be decentralizing. It can allow plant managers to make decisions without going to the top and individual plant workers to get on with things. On the other hand, again, it might seem paradoxical, we think the communication technologies, having lots of data available to people, that would necessarily be decentralizing. But in fact, again, some studies suggest that data and communication networks, the better they are, the more hierarchy you have, the more micromanaging you have, because the people at the top know exactly what you're doing down there. They can watch you perhaps in real time, look on their executive dashboard and say, hey, this department down here isn't doing what I told them to do, let's intervene. And of course, it also makes it easier for people at the lower levels to rely on the people at the top to make all the decisions for them, and therefore not to take the initiative. The other factor, as I hinted at before, is trust. The level of trust makes a big difference in how centralized or decentralized, how top-down or bottom-up things are. Again, another study has suggested that companies located in countries where levels of trust, according to various measures, are lower, will tend to be more centralized. If the country has a higher level of trust, then there's more decentralization. So those are just some of the factors that affect how the organizations will work out. Is this where I want to be next? Okay, so this is where I'm going to skip on a little bit before I talk about some of the specific practices in organizations. Oops, okay. Just to sort of point out some of the parallels here between organizations as we understand them and the organization of minds. I like this quote from Sam Goldwyn. I don't want any yes men in this organization. I want people to speak their minds, even if it does cost them their jobs. So there he was paying lip service to decentralization, autonomy, when not really wanting it, perhaps. Now, one kind of rather probably unappealing view of the future organizations, what you might call corporate personalities. There's a great example of this. Anybody who likes to read graphic novels, as I do, might want to pick up one of my favorite writers, Warren Ellis. He has a graphic novel called Ocean, which is set in space, and his corporation is running things out in space. But there's engaging very high costs, obviously, because they're way out on one of the far planets. And they want to know exactly what people are doing. They want to better control the situation exactly. So what they do is they require that all employees not just sign an agreement to say they'll do certain things, but they actually have to download a corporate personality template. So essentially, they're agreeing for the period of their contract to set aside their real selves. They still have memories and so on, but they can't act contrary to the programming. They're kind of like, a little bit like Borgs, I suppose, but it's a temporary situation. They're not completely integrated, but essentially they're running, Microsoft Personality or GEOS or something like that temporarily. So it's a way of really strictly controlling what they're doing. But more generally, we can think of organizations as persons. We can think of a different kind of corporate personality. This makes me think actually of, some of you will know of the writings of Sasha Chislenko, one of the early transhumanists and extropians. And he wrote about the concept of the exoself. And I think there's a lot of parallels between the exoself and outsourcing and hollowed out corporations, in the sense that the exoself that we can envision having, and perhaps AGIs could be built this way too, it may work out as the most efficient method. You have a core of the self, the basic values, principles, tendencies, personality, but then around that you have a cloud of personalities, processing abilities, cognitive resources, knowledge bases, all those things which you may want to use at some times and not others, and maybe only partially integrated with yourself. They may be part of you in a sense, but in some sense they're separable as well. You could take those away and you'd still be you to a large degree. And I think there's a lot of parallels between how organizations do that increasingly with outsourcing and not having to necessarily control everything completely internally. And that may be the way that future minds also work. And I think as transhumanists, we're more open to that idea because we understand how minds evolve. We understand where minds have come from to a large degree. We understand ideas like the society of mind that Marvin Minsky's talked about. We've read probably a lot of the neuropsychology, where we know that the brain consists of is really the end product of evolutionary processes that develop certain cognitive functions which really have come together in a way that usually coordinates and cooperates. But anybody who's read books by Oliver Sacks, for instance, knows that sometimes those cognitive processes come apart and don't function well together. The classic cases he discussed of, for instance, visual agnosia, the title of his book comes from that case, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. This was a fellow who had perfectly good his visual system was working fine. He could see everything normally. He could describe exactly what he was seeing geometrically, but he couldn't recognize what he was seeing. So one day he was going to go out and he was going to put on his hat, and because his wife's head had the same kind of shape as his hat, he tried to pick it up and put it on. So a very strange system where we think, well, normally if you can see something, you can recognize it, right? How could it be other than that? But in fact, those functions of the mind can come apart, and in extreme cases, they do. I think anybody who has a philosophical background can probably also see parallels in the thinking of, for instance, David Hume, who talked about the self as a commonwealth. It's not really a unitary thing. It's not a single Cartesian soul or ego, which can't be separated. In fact, it has a number of different bits floating around. Some of us are more integrated than others. Sometimes we find ourselves at odds with ourselves, and we may need a bit of discipline, except there's no one in charge. There's no real CEO. The ego seems to be more of a construct. There isn't really somebody at the top. As Daniel Dennett has argued, there's no little homunculus, no little guy behind the camera, behind your mind, making you do things. It's really, again, more of an organization. But from the inside, you don't really see it that way. You kind of fool into thinking that you're a real individual, rather than an organization. Yeah, so some of those ideas there. Thomas Metzinger and other recent philosophers also discussed this idea of the no-self view, again, that the self is really a construction. So let me go back to, let's see, how am I doing? So how do you achieve dynamic balance, whether we're talking about a corporation or a mind? Well, I'm going to have to go through some of this pretty quickly. I'm going to talk about some of the general principles for balancing order, and then some of the ways of achieving more imposed order, and then the opposite. Some of the techniques actually can be applied to both. Because we really want our organization to be consistent, hierarchical to some degree, methodical, dependable, powerful, but also adaptable, flexible, improvisational, resilient, and robust, as John was saying. Especially resilience is increasingly important, I think. I think the next speaker or the one after will be focusing on resilience in particular. That's a pretty tough thing to get to these days. So there are a number of ways of doing this. One thing is to use the principle of KISS, keep it simple strategically. Essentially to have a clear vision in mind, a clear goal, a clear set of principles, and formulate a simple strategy based on a few principles, and then let people find their own way to implement those principles, rather than trying to completely draw out a final map. In other words, really to use principles and vision, a compass, a general direction heading, which is very clear, but not a map. You don't want an exact map that tells you go from here to here to here to get to your goal. That generally isn't going to work in uncertain situations. Also to know your network. Here I think a very useful tool, and again I'm interested in how that might be applied to AI research, to future minds, is the tool of social or organizational network analysis, where you can use certain mathematical tools to examine an organization's network and find out who plays what roles in that network, and then tune it up in various ways. You can do that both for fortifying structure and for also allowing more order to bubble up from underneath. There are people who play certain roles, for instance, in organizations. There are peripheral experts. There are people who span boundaries between different parts of the organizations. It can be a very important role. There are people who are domain experts. There are connectors. There are people who have far more connections to other people in the organization than most people do. Now, if any of those critically important people drop out, your organization is going to have a very hard time. You may think, oh, we can just rehire this position. But if this person knows, 10,000 people in the organization, knows just who to send you to with a problem, that person's not easily replaceable. So in these network theories, there are several different roles that are very important to understand, both for increasing order by stabilizing the structure and also by freeing up the order, by letting people have resources to maintain order from below. I think another important thing is systematic surrender. Any organization can get very stultified, very rigid, if you don't have specific processes put in place to shake things up periodically. I think it's, anybody who's worked in a large organization for a while knows about projects which just won't die. Some managers' favorite projects who invested millions or billions of dollars in them, and failure is not an option to them, which is not always a good motto, as inspiring as it was in that movie. You should actually build in processes of review and require that certain projects be killed periodically, which is a very hard thing to do. There are some specific ways to do that. How am I doing for time, by the way, so I can? Okay. Okay, so let's look at, first of all, one side of the balance here. How do we... Oh, do I have this wrong? Actually, that should be fortifying order, not disorder. So, never mind. That comes later. Right. So fortifying order. Now, okay, so how do we strengthen order, first of all? Usually, certainly in large companies, the problem is usually that there's too much order, but sometimes you don't have enough or not in the right places, or it's not a very healthy kind of order. Order can be, we know that sometimes a little bit of disorder or randomness is a healthy thing. For instance, in human physiology, if you look at your heart rate, your heartbeat, and the electrical impulses going, if it's too regular, you're in big trouble. You're probably going to have a heart attack. Because actually a healthier heartbeat is one that is a little more erratic. It seems to have a little more randomness to it. Okay, so for fortifying order, then really what I've been talking about with the organizational network analysis can come in handy here. If you can find out where these unofficial hierarchies are, things which aren't on the organizational chart, they're officially not real chains of command, but in practice that's how things work. People go to Joe or Jane who has the expertise or who knows somebody in the other function across the street who we never talk to because they're foreigners over there. That can be very useful. And if you're a leader, you may need to know who these people are. And organizational network analysis can help you to understand that. It's also important to have clear decision rights, decision ownership. Really, that's kind of an internal application of how free markets work. Free markets don't work if there's complete chaos in an economy. They require property rights. They require that we know who owns what. So if you own that computer, I can't just come across and use it, because if that was the case, you wouldn't better plan your future. You wouldn't know whether you could work on your presentation or whether you could send your email. So it's very important that we have rights in that area. That's what allows property to work. But the same thing is true with decisions. It helps, you don't want to always over-define it, but it does help if you know who has the right to make this decision, or who else do I have to consult, and to be clear about that. If you don't really know, if you say, I'm really not sure whether I'm allowed to do that, or I'm not sure who I need to talk to, so I'll just leave it for now. That's what's going to happen. So defining decision rights, that can both increase emergent order, but it can also fortify order overall, just by stabilizing the organization. I've talked a little bit about leading with clarity, essentially, which helps people get on with things by giving them clear directives, but at a fairly high level. I use hierarchy cautiously, because, of course, we all know organizations which suffer from various effects, one named after Steve Jobs, the reality distortion field, especially with charismatic leaders, that can lead to people just following orders and not using their own initiative. So I'm going to be very careful with that. That can arise from fear, distrust of people within the organization, battles, territorial battles, and covering your ass. That can all be a very bad side effect of hierarchy. Another way to improve order a little bit is to base your strategy on certainties. Well, you may not think there are not very many certainties around, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. And we don't want to be overboard with what we mean by certainties. We mean things which are pretty damn certain over the next 20 years. Well, there are a few of those. It's hard to find them, but demographics can be a good source of certainties, because people aren't, generations don't change instantly. They change rather slowly. And certainly, once you start projecting populations out 50, 60, 70 years, you start getting more errors. But in the short run, demographic trends tend to change fairly slowly, at least they have so far, because that may turn out to be completely wrong in the future. But there are other things, technological megatrends. We can't really project, well, okay, Ray Kurzweil thinks we can project a lot of technology trends very exactly. I agree that we can probably project some of those, but I think in general, you're safer projecting very general technology megatrends. You know that technology is going to combine and merge and mutate, and that makes it very hard to predict things specifically. But I think Ray's on pretty safe ground when he projects the general Moore's law kinds of projections. So those kind of things we can be pretty sure of for at least a number of years. But it's true there aren't very many of those. Okay, manipulate the matrix. Well, that's the idea that there are actually some systematic ways of structuring organizations and unstructuring them. There are various tools which I can't really go into detail, but for instance, Eric Brynjolfsson, an organizational economist, and his colleagues have developed a thing called the matrix of change, which is a pretty systematic way of surveying how organizations are structured, what the dependencies are, what the interdependencies are, and then reorganizing those in a systematic manner to essentially force people to change and to innovate and to remove blockages to innovation. And then systematic innovation methods, although innovation seems to be a sort of an anti-imposed order, there are actually ways of driving innovation using certain methods. So rather than letting it be free form and bubbling up, you can actually kind of compel innovation to happen. A number of you are probably familiar with Altshuler's systematic inventive thinking. Essentially, it's taking a problem and defining it into certain dimensions. Think of a kind of a hypercube. Think of a Rubik's Cube, but a hyper Rubik's Cube, where you've defined the dimensions, the edges, and so on. And then you twist that in various directions according to certain procedures. And you look at the result and you say, well, let's try this. And it can force you to try new combinations you wouldn't have thought of by systematizing that process. So it's a little bit paradoxical. You're using a very structured method to force innovation. But in fact, if you think about it, many innovations are not entirely out of the blue. They tend to arise by combining existing ideas in novel ways. This is just a way of making this more automatic. And also, it's, of course, very important to diffuse positive feedback. It may sound like a good thing, but I think this is my biggest worry, actually, for post-humans, is this kind of positive feedback where you enjoy something, so you tweak your mind so you enjoy it even more and keep doing more of it. And, of course, then you'll tend to remove the distraction so you can do more of that, and you may end up in some kind of obsessive, borderline personality. That's actually quite a worry for me about post-human minds. But we see that in organizations too. Classically, I think Enron is a classic example of that, where all their procedures were about rewarding people for doing things, incentives, bonuses, patting people on the back, firing people who failed at anything. It was a very harsh, positive feedback culture in that sense, and that's what drove them off the rails, I think. Okay, so the other side of the balance, encouraging emergent order. Well, again, social network analysis, organizational network analysis can allow you to make people more autonomous by revealing crucial knowledge brokers, allowing you to reward those people, well, not reward, but support those people who are in crucial positions, whether they're connectors or experts, giving them more resources and more support. So you're not really controlling what they're doing, you're just recognizing their importance in the network and then supporting it. You can also use electronic monitoring tools and electronic questionnaires to better understand that network and to understand the knowledge flows and then support that. I'm going to skip some of these just because I have way too many items. But constructive criticism. That's a nice thing to talk about. Everybody's in favor of constructive criticism, except when it's criticizing me, then I'm not so happy about it. So it's very hard, actually, for leaders to encourage that because they know they don't want to be questioned, and obviously they're wiser than everybody else. So it really takes exceptional leaders to really systematically introduce this in organizations. And this is one way also of avoiding positive feedback. So really what you have to do is set some pretty strict processes in place where you'll actually audit the organization every so often to find people who retaliate against those who criticize them. You want to try and rule that out. You want to actively discourage that. And of course, lead by example. And also learn how to critique ideas rather than people. In other words, cognitive or task conflict rather than personal conflict. There's a huge difference. Plenty of studies show there's an enormous difference between those two things. So learn how to separate the personality from the ideas. That's why I tend to try to avoid saying you're wrong in an argument. I rather say what you said is mistaken. It's a psychological difference. It may seem trivial, but it reduces defensiveness. You don't want to identify yourself with your ideas. So whether that's one mind trying to find its way to truth, or it's an organization trying to seek the truth, constructive criticism, I think, is critical. And again, decision rights come in here. By clarifying decision roles, You enable distributive initiative, but it's very important, I think, to own and control decisions and not information. We don't want to control the information as such. That should be a resource that spreads around, but the decisions can be owned and controlled. And part of that also is pushing decision-making down as far as you can to employees who are dealing with customers and right in the front lines of the market. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up here. Other tools that you can use are, actually John mentioned this one too, he talked about World of Warcraft being a great training ground. In general, competitive business simulations can be very powerful tools by taking people out of their regular office environment and putting them in uncomfortable and difficult situations where they have to think fast. So some of those simulations are really very effective, and they can be very specifically business-oriented more than World of Warcraft. Okay, there's a lot of you are familiar with the cognitive psychology literature and the problem of anchoring on decisions and anchoring on initial knowledge. There are various ways of dealing with that. One way is to regularly use outside sources and experts so that you're not initially anchoring on somebody's judgment within the organization. Scenario planning can be helpful by forcing people, and again, a fairly structured way, to think about alternative possibilities. And I think another effective method is to take a bit of the Stephen Covey approach and begin with the end in mind, as he likes to say. Now, the rationale behind that is if you start off, okay, we're here, we want to get to there in the future with our business, how do we get there? People, again, will tend to anchor on their first solution and the first way of seeing things. If you start off with the goal and then work backwards, you're open to more possibilities as to how you get to the final result. So it's a fairly simple way of avoiding some of that problem. Okay, other possible methods very quickly. To set minds 3, you can adopt something like 3M's 15% rule, where you give employees a certain fraction of their time to do whatever they want, as long as it's related to the business in some way. They have time for their own projects. Or Corning's Friday afternoon experiments. So these are institutionalized free time for individuals to pursue projects which may or may not work out for the company. And I think Google's been quite successful adopting that approach too. Okay, I should probably skip over the rest as I'm running out of time, but experimenting with paradoxical management essentially means asking yourself, okay, there's a lot of information out there in the business magazines, and I read a lot of this stuff, which seems like it's very well thought out and very well developed and very systematic. And a lot of top companies are using certain methods of doing things. If Intel's doing it, if Microsoft's doing it, if Apple's doing it, surely it must make sense. If all the top companies in the field do this, surely we should do the same thing. Well, not always. Sometimes you want to be paradoxical in the sense that you want to do something radically at variance with the standard practice. Because best practice, as they like to call it in industry, best practice is not necessarily evidence-based practice or evidence-based management. You want to actually examine all these Harvard Business Review articles that say, this is the way the best companies do things. Well, that, of course, is a selection bias. They're looking only at the successful companies. They're not looking at the unsuccessful companies. This is a huge problem in business literature, in fact. They may have used the same things and failed. So what you want to really do is see, has this been tested? Have we looked at the failures? And do these methods actually work? Maybe you actually want to do some crazy things. Instead of using job interviews to screen candidates, maybe just use them to get ideas from people. Maybe you want to find people who are happy in the company and go and make them unhappy and put them in conflict with each other. There are all kinds of possibilities. However, I've run out of time here, so I just want to leave you with the thought that I've run through a lot of different possible things. I haven't even talked about decision markets and forecast markets in organizations. Could some of these principles be applied to the development of AGI, where we have very complex minds? Could we use some of these methods to create more healthy post-human minds as we get more and more complex? All right, thank you.